Welcome to your Apple Update. I'm your host, John Sherrod. If you would, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so that you are aware when I release new content. I try to get a new episode out twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, although you might not see it until Wednesday and Friday. But definitely plan to keep this going as there's more to cover in the world of Apple. There's always new stuff coming out, especially as Apple expands into not only hardware and software, which it's been doing for decades, but now also getting more and more heavily into services. We just had the services event last week. And what I want to talk about in this episode is Apple TV. And Apple's got some confusing branding around the term Apple TV now because, we have the Apple TV app, which has been on the Apple TV device as well as iPhone and iPad for some time, which is kind of like an aggregator for all the TV and movie content that you watch, or at least that's Apple's idea for it. We've got an update to that coming out in May, as we talked about in the wrap-up to Apple Services event. We also now have this upcoming Apple TV channels where you'll be able to subscribe to various channels like CBS All Access, Amazon Prime, HBO Go, various things like that, right through Apple's TV app instead of having to download the app separately in order to subscribe to that content. So that's great. Then we've also got Apple TV Plus, which is Apple's, Netflix competitor is not the exact thing, but basically this is Apple's foray into releasing original content under its own brand. That's Apple TV Plus. We've got, again, all these different things, but that's not what I'm talking about, at least not primarily. In this episode, I want to talk about this guy, the actual Apple TV hardware device. And this is actually one of the older models here. I have owned every model of Apple TV since they first came out in 2007. It's crazy that it's been that long. Apple first announced it in late 2006. And Apple TV has been something that Apple for a long time referred to as a hobby. It was pretty clear that it was something they were interested in. They were dabbling their toe into various things around the TV product, but they didn't actually look at it as a major business. And now that's all changing. But what really is the status of this guy? And what really made me start thinking about this is, when we've known for a long time that Apple was going to come out with its own Netflix competitor. And the question was, well, is this a pitch to sell more Apple TV hardware devices? And if so, will it remain exclusive to the Apple TV hardware and iPhone and, et cetera? Or is Apple going to release it for other devices? And we really didn't know until recently, and started this January, even before Apple made its recent end of March announcement about Apple TV Plus. Back in early January, right after Christmas, Apple and Samsung co-announced that Apple would be bringing the Apple TV app to Samsung TVs. If you have a 2018 or 2019 Samsung TV, sometime later this year, you'll be able to download the Apple TV app onto it. And so that really started us thinking, okay, well, how far is this going to go? And since then, we've learned that Apple is expanding that out to LG TVs, Sony TVs, and I want to say Vizio. And they also, at the recent services event, announced that you'll be able to get the Apple TV app on Roku and Amazon Fire devices. And, the Roku news had been kind of leaking out a little bit, but really surprising to see it come to the Amazon Fire TV, just given some of the squabbling Apple and Amazon have done over the years, haggling over, revenue sharing for purchases and subscriptions on iOS devices, and the fact that for a long time you couldn't buy the Apple TV in the Amazon store, various things like that. So it was really kind of surprising to see that announcement. But looking at it, it totally makes sense, rather than the streaming TV service being a way to prop up this device. Apple is really going all in on the services model of Apple TV Plus and this channels offering. And that's really going to be their main TV strategy going forward. So that really leaves us kind of wondering, what is the future for the Apple TV box? And I have said for a long time that the Apple TV is my favorite Apple product. And I love many other Apple products, of course. And for you, it might be the iPhone or the Mac. And I love those as well. But the Apple TV has long been an area of intense interest for me as an Apple fan, because I'm an Apple enthusiast, but I'm also a fan of movies and TV. So you're just combining all these things together, and you've got a product that seems to be made for me. For a long time, the pace of development of the Apple TV device was glacial. We finally got in 2015 when Apple released what they're now calling the Apple TV HD, which was the first Apple TV model to have an app store, to be able to search across content providers, to be able to kind of customize and make the Apple TV experience whatever you wanted it to be for yourself, both as a consumer and also as a developer, being able to create your own apps and games and channels and things like that for it. So that really opened up a lot of doors. And at the time, Tim Cook made the comment, I don't think I have the exact quote. I do have the exact quote. He said, "We believe the future of TV is apps." And that seemed to make a lot of sense at the time. Apple was trying to reproduce the app ecosystem experience on the television that they had done so successfully on the phone. And they tried to do that with the Apple Watch initially that same year as well, where they really brought in apps and maybe were too early with that. Now, I think apps on the Apple TV have been more successful, but the Apple TV is a very niche product. I mean, the streaming TV boxes are a little bit of a niche product in general, but the Apple TV really is, because it's vastly more expensive. Maybe vastly is not the right term, but you can get a Roku device for $40 that has 4K support, where you can stream 4K television content. Whereas, these guys, set you back, as little as $150, as little as $150. So they're not cheap, and there's a lot cheaper items in that range. And to add to that, I've long said that the Apple TV's biggest competitor isn't Roku or Amazon Fire TV sticks or whatever. It's your smart TV. And when Apple first introduced the Apple TV product back in 2006, in late 2006, and shipped it in early 2007, there either weren't any smart TVs or they were very early. That really is a more recent, in the last few years, kind of development. So in some ways it made a lot more sense then than it does now. Because if you're the sort of consumer who just wants the ability to be able to stream Netflix, maybe Amazon Prime, maybe HBO Go, if that's all you care about, then you can get that through any TV you buy at the store. Even inexpensive TVs have that capability now. They have their own built-in apps, essentially. So that's why, honestly, I've wanted to see Apple make its own television, not only for that reason, for other reasons as well, but because that's really been Apple TV's biggest competitor, is that. And then, of course, on top of that, you have the much lesser cost devices, streaming boxes from Roku and Amazon. So it's been a difficult. It's been difficult for the Apple TV to find success, and then in addition to the fact that for a good chunk of time there, you weren't able to purchase those on Amazon, and Amazon, of course, is such a big retailer that not being in that store was definitely hurting the product. So, we've now got Apple releasing its streaming TV, its Apple TV app on these other TVs and smart boxes. Because if you think about the reasons why you wanted an Apple TV, you could get Netflix and Amazon Prime a lot of places, but the reason why you really wanted an Apple TV always was the ability to play back content that you purchased or rented in iTunes, as far as movies and TV show episodes, and maybe stream music and that sort of thing. And for a long time, the Apple TV was the only way to get that if you were invested in the iTunes ecosystem in particular. And I used to be a big DVD guy and then a big Blu-ray guy, and since 2015, I've been all in on iTunes for a variety of reasons that I should do a separate video on that at some point. But now you won't have that restriction, because you'll be able to play back iTunes purchases on your Samsung TV without having any device plugged into it, or on your Amazon Fire Stick, or your Roku. So you don't need the Apple TV for that anymore. AirPlay is another thing. The ability to be watching something or listening to something on your iPhone and just say, I want to throw that up on the TV and be able to play it back there. There are some competing products. Google has had its Google Cast thing, its Chromecast stuff. But if you wanted AirPlay, you really had to have an Apple TV. And that's starting to erode away too, because Apple announced that those Samsung TVs, for example, are going to be able to have AirPlay playback as well. And if you go to the AirPlay website, the very first image you see is not an Apple TV. It's actually a Samsung TV where they're demonstrating how you can AirPlay right to your television. So iTunes content, you can now get that other places. AirPlay, those walls are starting to crumble, and you're starting to see that come officially to other places. And of course, for a while now, you've been able to have AirPlay to several smart speakers and things like that. So the reasons for kind of locking you in or making the Apple TV a really compelling product, slowly you're starting to go away. And then the other thing that could be a differentiator that could keep the Apple TV an important product, or at least an important niche product for Apple, is gaming. And Apple kind of shot itself in the foot early on, because when the Apple TV with the tvOS App Store first came out in 2015, Apple made some kind of draconian rules. For example, they said that your app bundle couldn't be more than 200 megabytes, and a lot of times these games have all these graphical elements that require a lot more space than that. And Apple did eventually relent, but it was a while before they did on that particular rule. And they also, when they first were kind of previewing the Apple TV, they even showed screenshots that showed that if you have a game, you as a game developer can require an actual game controller, not the actual remote that comes with the Apple TV, but a real game controller for your game. But then Apple said, nope, if you come out with a game for the Apple TV, it's got to be compatible with the little Siri remote that comes with the Apple TV. And that was a mistake, and that really kind of hindered the adoption from game developers, because a lot of there are gameplay styles that work great with the Apple TV remote, but there's an awful lot of gameplay styles that really do require a game controller. And again, that's one that they've since relented on, but they lost some potential, goodwill with developers early on with games. And so one of the things that they announced at the services event last week was that they're going to be coming out later this year with a subscription product called Apple Arcade that you can use on your iPhone or your Mac. They said Mac, which was great, or your Apple TV. But we don't know a whole lot of details about that. They definitely showed off some of the games that'll be coming with that. We don't know pricing yet. I would still love to see Apple come out with its own game controller. I think that would be the best way to really help sell game developers on Apple's commitment to the Apple TV as a platform. And you could use that game controller with your Mac or your iPhone, but instead we're kind of limited to something that is essentially an Xbox clone that all these these third-party hardware manufacturers can make. They just called the MFI, or Made for iPhone game controllers, and they're fine, but I would love to see Apple kind of come out with its own thing. So, gaming could be a differentiator, and it could be something that really keeps interest going in the Apple TV product. But we're just going to have to wait and see on that. And so kind of the last thing that makes the Apple TV compelling for me is that if you generally like the way Apple designs software and user interfaces and user experiences, well, the only way to get that in the way that Apple does it is to buy an Apple TV. And so that, for me, is certainly still a compelling reason. The same reason why I wanted Apple to come out with a phone for years before the iPhone came out, because the the cell phone experience sucked as far as user experience went. And I knew that Apple could solve that problem, because that was what Apple excelled at, perhaps better than anything else, was making software that was easy and enjoyable to use. And of course, they did that with great success with the iPhone. And the Apple TV the Apple TV experience, or the tvOS experience, has not been nearly as transformative as the iOS experience was for for how we interact with phones. But it is still the best user experience you can get out there. So that's still something. But again, you're paying a steep price to get that. So you've got to value that really highly if that's something you're willing to make that purchase on. So it's interesting. I feel like we're at a state of flux with my favorite Apple product, where I don't know if Apple's going to continue making these for a tremendously much longer in the future. I hope that they do. And I guess the question is, if you're watching this and you don't have an Apple TV, do you need one? And it really kind of depends on what you're looking to get out of the experience. Again, if you want to have the Apple television experience, that's the only way to get that in a comprehensive way. But if all you want to be able to have is the Apple TV app and the ability to watch, the movies that you purchased in iTunes, that sort of thing, and you also want to be able to watch Netflix and Amazon Prime, well, again, Samsung TV is a great product, or again, a Roku is a very inexpensive product that's going to meet that need. I think, again, some of these other things where it kind of remains to be seen is, what is this Apple Arcade experience like for Apple TV, and does that make it a compelling service? If that takes off and it's big, and especially if Apple really invests in it, particularly if they come out with a game controller, then again, it could still be a very compelling product. I mean, the Apple TV could be a legitimate gaming console for a lot of different game types if Apple really makes a commitment to it and gets developer buy-in. But we're going to have to wait and see. But that's it. I mean, speculation. We don't know a lot of these things, but I just really wanted to kind of think these things through with you, especially because, as I said, this is something I love. That's it for this episode of Your Apple Update. Again, hit that subscribe button so you get updates when I release a new video, and I will see you next time.